4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
In 1968, the newly elected Pierre Trudeau tabled Omnibus Bill C-150, titled the Criminal Law Amendment Act. Considered the largest omnibus bill ever tabled at 128 pages, the bill decriminalized certain acts of homosexuality, legalized abortion and contraception, updated divorce laws, permitted lotteries, imposed restrictions on gun ownership, brought in new drinking and driving penalties, outlawed harassing telephone calls, regulated misleading advertising and redefined what constituted cruelty to animals. The British Parliament's adoption of the Sexual Offences Act in 1967, which decriminalised homosexual acts in England and Wales, and the prosecution of George Clifford put the issues of homosexuality in the spotlight, influencing Trudeau's decision to include it in C-150 amendments. In 1965, Everett Clifford was arrested. He acknowledged to the police that he had been gay for 24 years and was unlikely to change. 2 years later, he was sentenced to an indefinitely long term in prison as a dangerous sex offender. In 1967, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld a lower court ruling which suggested life imprisonment as the maximum penalty for homosexual behavior. An intense campaign erupted over the C-150 amendments, led by the Catholics of Quebec, who charged the communists, socialists and atheists were behind the amendments. Anti-gay smear campaigns were launched. Trudeau and the Liberal Party was labelled beasts of Sodom, and a demand for a public referendum on homosexuality and abortion was made. Trudeau defended the bill, telling the press there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. What's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code. Intentional or not, the introduction of the decriminalization of what is really the heart of the issue, a simple sex act between two consenting adults, created a bill that not only removed the state from the bedroom but removed the church from the state. Defeating the bill would allow religious influence over the state to continue to ride roughshod over the personal lives of Canadians. Being of the omnibus nature, C-150 had to be voted on in a block. The bill passed third reading in the House of Commons by a vote of 149 to 55. 119 Liberals, 18 New Democrats and 12 Progressive Conservatives voted yes, and 43 Progressive Conservatives, 11 Creedistists, and 1 Liberal voted no. 47 years later, homosexuality, abortion and contraception, restrictions on gun ownership, and even what constitutes cruelty to animals are still hot-button issues used to ignite the electorate. Most Canadians are not aware of Bill C-150, and what it did to advance human rights. Ask about Pierre Trudeau's policies, and you will most likely be cited the notorious National Energy Program. Trudeau's contributions to human rights in Canada is a legacy Stephen Harper's Conservatives wish to restrain. Canada uses a method of voting referred to as first past the post. Ironically, at the rider level it is the candidate who comes out of the election with the popular vote who is declared the winner. First past the post is a very simple method, winner takes all. The candidate, as we can see, may have less than 50% of the vote but is still the winner. Not very equitable in a multi-party system, the vote has not been refined, producing a situation that does not reflect a clear majority.
In the 2011 Canadian federal election, over 24 million people were eligible to cast a ballot. 5.8 million votes were cast for the Conservative Party, receiving 39.62% of the popular vote. 4.5 million voters decided to support NDP candidates, they received 30.63% of the popular vote. 2.7 million Canadians voted Liberal, equal to 18.91% of the vote, and 889,000 people voted for the Bloc Party, or 6.4% of the votes. 575,000 Canadians voted Green, giving them 3.91% of the popular vote. And finally, 127,000 people voted for other candidates, or 0.89% of the votes. Of the 24 million qualified Canadian voters, 9.5 million decided not to participate in the election process. Of the 308 parliamentary seats available, under the first-past-the-post voting structure, with 39.62% of the popular vote, the Conservative Party secured 57% of the seats, for 166 seats. The NDP, with official opposition status, won 33.4% of the seats for a total of 103 seats. The Liberal Party was able to elect 34 MPs, and get 11.4% of the seats. The Bloc's 6.1% of the seats, equals 4 MPs. And the Green Party's 1 seat, using the first-past-the-post voting method, equals 3.9% of the seats in Parliament. The Conservative Party has 1 seat for every 35,134 votes, and the Green Party has 1 seat for every 576,221 votes. A combined total of 8,750,658 votes secured 142 seats in opposition to the government. The Conservative Party's 5,832,000 votes gave them 166 seats. With 39% of the popular vote given to them by 24% of the electorate, the Conservative Party won a majority government. But the overall popular vote has no bearing in the final outcome or the Canadian citizens' representation in Parliament using Canada's first-past-the-post voting method. Using proportional representation and the results of the 2011 election as an example, we see a more equitable distribution of seats that reflects the popular vote. The Conservative Party's 5,832,000 votes would have given them 123 seats. The Conservative Party would lose 43 seats. The NDP would have 7 fewer seats, at 96. The Liberals would gain 26, giving them 59 seats. The Bloc Party, with 6.4% of the popular vote, would get 14 more MPs, for a total of 18 seats. And the Green Party's 3.91% of the vote, in the proportional representation voting system equals 11 more seats in parliaments, 12 in total. The voter ratio for all MPs, based on the popular vote would be, between 47 and 48,000. A combined total of 8,750,658 votes would have secured 184 seats in opposition to the government's 123 seats.
It must be noted that proportional representation would require a restructuring of the voting procedure. In a multi-party race there are a few different methods. One method we already use at the municipal level is voter preference. The voter ranks individual candidates in order of preference. During the count, as candidates are elected or eliminated, surplus or discarded votes that would otherwise be wasted are transferred to other candidates, according to the voters' preferences. That method is referred to as a single transferable vote. There is also mixed member proportional representation, and disproportional apportionment. But Stephen Harper is well aware the Conservative Party's chances are narrowed down considerably if the electorate on the left was able to rally their votes. Politicians who are not true to the notion of proper representation for the people just talk about proportional representation when they are the opposition party. But given the chance to govern, the idea of proportional representation is quickly swept under the table and declared to be too complicated and expensive. Stephen Harper made numerous declarations peddling the virtues of proportional representation to appeal to his supporters. But 3 elections into his governance and a 4th election on the horizon, proportional representation was not part of any election reform. In fact, Stephen Harper made it more difficult to vote. Canada's current political model is broken. It's far too easy for a small group of ideologues to ride herd over the rest of Canadians. Stephen Harper's conservative supporters often quote the studies and conclusions of think tanks like the Fraser Institute and the National Citizens Coalition. If you ask the average middle-class conservative supporter about raising the minimum wage, the response is an echo of the think tank's proclamation that there will be massive job losses because the low wages help keep companies profitable. Ask them if it's okay for the social safety net, i.e. the taxpayer, to help support the working poor who work for those companies, with a progressive tax scheme so the worker pays little to no payroll tax. The response would most likely be no, they need to pay taxes. But if you ask the average middle-class conservative supporter if the working poor should subsidize the cost of their hamburgers with poverty wages, the current conservative dogma would require them to say yes. What would surely signal the destruction of the economy would be having the cost of a hamburger go up. Maybe McDonald's, Walmart, and other multinationals that pay low wages could help save the Western economies by taking fewer profits so the employees could be contributors to the tax base. Driven by stock values, those notions would appear to be unachievable. It would seem the conservatives don't want to pay for the lemon, but still want the lemonade.
The free market is a market system in which the prices for goods and services are set freely by the laws and forces of supply and demand, and free from any intervention by a government, free from all forms of economic privilege, monopolies and artificial scarcities. General equilibrium theory has demonstrated, with varying degrees of mathematical rigor over time, that under certain conditions of competition, the law of supply and demand predominates in this ideal free and competitive market, influencing prices toward an equilibrium that balances the demands for the products against the supplies.
Under certain conditions of competition, think tank economists are trying to convince people those conditions are complete deregulation and more free trade deals. In Canada's case, exporting resources and importing goods. Deals with non-democratic states who promise they will introduce human rights reforms, but never seem to fulfill those promises. The workers' incomes may go up, and their ability to consume will increase, but to object to government policies is met with security state force. These same non-democratic states can easily use the control over labor to gain leverage in the free market against the high-priced Western labor force.
The ideal free market model is commonly applied to wages in the market for labor. The typical roles of supplier and consumer are reversed. The suppliers are individuals who try to sell their labor for the highest price. The consumers are businesses, which try to buy that type of labor they need at the lowest price. As more people offer their labor in that market, the wages decrease and the levels of employment increase, as the supply curve shifts to the advantage of the employer. The opposite happens if fewer people offer their wages in the market as the supply advantage shifts to the worker.
The ability to draw from a global labor pool certainly puts the workers at a definite disadvantage. Multinationals have no allegiance with any one country, and see the global labor force as a commodity in the supply chain. A utopian's philosophy, unworkable on a global scale. Balance can only be achieved when everything, including governing principles, regulations, and the standard of living, are in parallel in nations trading in labor. Presented by the media daily are reports documenting the West's fall from grace and simultaneous rise to greatness as the result of the free market system. We have been presented with what could be defined as a moral hazard. The ignorant parties, the people, lacks information about the performance of the free market system and must free trade agreements to make proper assessments. The consequences of globalization are kept clouded to allow for some to gain advantages over others. The destruction of unions took away labor's seat at the table when these trade agreements have been drafted. The Western lemon workforce now even lacks the ability to retaliate for the breach of a trade agreement with non-democratic states. Trade disputes are settled by international trade tribunals with binding arbitration that shreds the laws in Western nations, and dismantle the regulatory authorities that prevent corporate lawlessness. Market exploitation by critical players that are aware of the destructive nature of their actions has created economic storms that ravage economies. Chalked up to unforeseen circumstance, in reality the storms are brought on because regulations were removed that stop the destructive practice. The free market purist is blinded by ideology. Factoring in predatory capitalism was not part of the resolution that produced the free market prophecies. Canadians are being asked to make a dramatic change to their moral standards to entice the capital investors. Investors who made their billions exploiting third world labor in countries without democracy. The international investors' terms and conditions for investment have been presented. They involved Canadians dropping their standards when it comes to protecting the environment, labor, and the social safety net. The terms demanded also include even lower taxes and more incentives. Playing one country against the other to see who is willing to give the most to buy jobs. Under Stephen Harper, that means enjoying lax regulations, low corporate taxes, and royalties so low they need not even worry about paying them. Ironically, they will also have the opportunity to exploit the Western lemon workforce's free market social welfare model that props up business by subsidizing the workforce. A conundrum for the investors, considering the neoliberal free market principles demands they dismantle those subsidies that offset their costs and increase profits. Today's neoliberal free market mystics like Stephen Harper have convinced the Canadian people that any attempts to rein in corporate greed will stop investments and collapse the fragile economy. We have been told by the think tank Prophets, the sign of a healthy economy is measured by how good the rich are doing. Their wealth will just trickle down to the masses. In truth, it's the opposite. How well are the poor making out? Fewer people living below the low-income threshold means workers earn more. The Keynesian model, that built the middle class and created a tax base that could build a modern nation, was based on fair wages and a more even distribution of income. The wealthy were taxed heavily if they started to hoard their money and pull it out of the system. The first mistake was making it possible for the wealthy to interrupt the flow of money down to the working class. By avoiding taxes and moving their profits offshore, they interrupted the redistribution of income. Taxes build public infrastructure, and infrastructure creates jobs, that distributes wealth taken from the rich through higher taxes back into the economy. The second mistake was to allow wages to drop below the low-income cutoff, dragging the middle class's wages down with it. The monies that would be paid to workers is instead siphoned off into profits where the tax rate is much lower and the income distribution is now much narrower. If businesses are made to pay the true costs of labor, the reliance on the social safety net by the working class would drop. The more people paying taxes, the more the tax burden is spread out. Businesses that rely on paying workers below the low-income threshold are asking the state to make up the difference to keep them profitable. The Keynesian model protected industries and markets so they could pay a fair wage. The free market system has to prop up the Western workers so business gets away without providing a living wage. As wages drop, more and more of these businesses are operating as lemons, relying on the state to support their workers, a failed business model according to the free market philosophy. As wages drop even lower, taxes are reduced, more workers need assistance, a snowball effect has begun. The Western labor force cannot compete with countries that have low wages, high poverty rates, no labor standards and no effective regulatory structure, who are ruled over by a corruption and greedy chauvinistic elite. The effects of hollowing out the tax base have now become apparent. The only way Western governments can balance their budgets is by cutting assistance to the poor and middle class. In Canada, that includes the public healthcare system. Borrowing more money from international creditors, raising the payroll tax and residential property taxes have to make up the shortfall. The business community in Canada, and in most Western nations, have been swindled into becoming ardent supporters of neoconservative policies. The lowest corporate tax rates in the G7 nations ensures Canada's Conservative Party has a full war chest at re-election time. In exchange for their donations, the confused conservative business community and supporters are demanding a mixed bag of contradictions. They want even lower corporate taxes, but still want a first world infrastructure. They want the minimum wage to stay below the income threshold, but also want massive cuts to the programs that support low-income workers. They want the elimination of the progressive tax system, so low and medium income workers have to pay more taxes. and the high-income earners and the wealthy have to pay fewer taxes. Canadians have been told, supply and demand will regulate the wages of Canadian workers, and bring them up when demand is high. But at the same time, the conservative business community asked for, and got, cheap third-world temporary foreign workers. A premature attempt by conservative politicians, and an irresponsible business community to open up Canada to the global labour pool. The conservative business community wants the Canadian healthcare system privatized and put in the hands of insurance companies. Fooled by the think tank profits, they have not realized they will have to start paying much higher insurance premiums for themselves and their employees as a benefit package and part of their wage. The cost of doing business will go up. The publicly funded healthcare system acts as a wage subsidy provided by the taxpayer for every business in Canada. The conservative business community wants the social safety net turned back over to charitable organizations, pre-war charity hospitals and schools run by religious organizations to service the poor. The conservative business community wants a skilled workforce, but they eagerly vote for the party who wants to defund the public schools, colleges and universities. Canadians have a few decisions to make. Do they want the transition to globalization to be on the backs of the working poor and impoverished? Are they ready to abandon the social safety net and hope they don't fall victim to a free market bubble? Are they ready to lower their expectations and the expectations they have for their children's future and become a low-wage society servicing each other? Are they ready to have the country stripped of its rights to control its natural resources? Are they ready to turn the public sector over completely to for-profit multinationals? The opportunity for Canadians to choose may soon disappear. The Conservative supporters believe they will receive a windfall when Stephen Harper has fulfilled his mandate and dismantled the social safety net. Libertarian storybook fantasies have made them honestly believe payroll taxes will drop dramatically to a point where a simple sales tax will support the federal government. Blinded by the personality cult that surrounds Stephen Harper, Conservative supporters, and indeed most Canadians have not yet realized the money ripped away from the healthcare system, and other programs that help Canadian families, is being retasked to pay for the security state apparatus being created. Billions have already been spent on the Communications Security Establishment. CSE is Canada's electronic spy agency. A massive data center, analysts and private security contractors tied to international corporations, along with a fully empowered expanded civilian secret police force already waiting in the wings for Bill C-51, Stephen Harper's Security State Omnibus Bill. Now put into law, C-51, which among other things, permits the spy service to ask a judge for permission to violate the Charter of Rights. Canadians must ask themselves if they are willing to support a political party that, when given power, initiate and pass legislation using omnibus bills that allow the judicial system to legally circumvent the constitutional rights of its citizens. It would appear Canada's democracy has ceased to exist, and a blank piece of paper is serving as the Charter of Rights. The think tank prophets have successfully confused and tricked large portions of the population into believing their studies and predictions, but not surprisingly, have become silent when the real threats to democracy are splayed out before them. It has become quite clear in the last 15 years, the pillars of the neoliberal grand design are collapsing. More and more average citizens are willing to step into the fray to combat irresponsible and dangerous policies, willing to face a potential assault by the police, be put on a watch list and placed under electronic surveillance by the state. Stephen Harper has made two things perfectly clear to Canadians: if you don't want to get hurt, stay home. If you don't want to be put on a watch list, or put under electronic surveillance, then don't be an activist. It is becoming quite clear to the Western Lemon workforce where they went wrong, and who led them down this path. Inviting non-democratic states to participate in the economic amalgamation of democratic states was the third biggest mistake and has brought about the ruin of Western democracies. The neoliberal global utopia the economic prophets predicted in the 70s was simply a theory devised by ideologues that has gone horribly wrong. The confusing prophecies have allowed radical fringe groups to infiltrate Western governments and undermine democracy. The vision has changed from the 70s. As globalization starts to fail, the neoliberals are attempting to install dictatorial powers in Western nations to maintain their control over the population. Stephen Harper has embraced those new ideals for Canada, and the twisted and warped post-9/11 conservatives' vision for all Western nations. A Christian version of a Middle East neoconservative police state, ruled over by Christian fundamentalists like Stephen Harper. A state that produces a steady stream of propaganda praising the leaders. A police state, with a legal system that has been subverted to include religious laws and unrestricted surveillance powers. Laws are enforced using police brutality dished out by overzealous believers and secret police. You would think Canadians would prefer the Northern European welfare state model, but seem to be voting for the neoconservative religious state. Stephen Harper's serial abuse of power reveals a man who has given up on democracy. Harper's history has demonstrated to Canadians he is a single-minded man not capable of compromise. Operating in a democratic system that requires honest men and women to negotiate in good faith is simply not possible for Stephen Harper. His governing style is in conflict with democratic values. His ideology is leading Canada down a path to destruction. Unwilling to compromise, his reforms are seen as so radical the only way he can force the people of Canada to accept his twisted principles is to deceive them and force his will on Canadians using omnibus legislation. Capitalism without democracy, where the elite dictate government policy, a single party rules, morality is enforced by laws formulated by conservative think tanks using religious and political doctrine. A regulatory regime and labor standards will be non-existent or not enforced. The business communities will be free to exploit the workers and the environment without regard to the social ramifications or cost. Canada under the Harper government is tracking toward that very outcome. Stephen Harper has made it very clear those are his goals. The hundreds of think tanks like the Fraser Institute and Stephen Harper's National Citizens Coalition would appear to be a collection of naive children wishing for an unattainable utopia, but in reality they are the greatest con men to ever walk the earth. Our biggest mistake, the one that could prove to be fatal to democracy, was trusting the think tank prophets and believing in the think tank prophecies.